we're moving. Good. In this time of prayer and meditation, notice I often use the two words interminglingly or interchangeably, because we start off meditating, considering something, and then we break forth into prayer, and then our prayer seems to hit a dead end, and we go back to meditating again. So it's often goes like that. And I wanted to say this really from the beginning. I kind of assumed you would do it anyway. That if something I say takes you off into prayer, follow it. Don't feel you've got to follow what I'm saying so much. Just go with what's happening, because we're trying to remember entering the journey of our hearts and learning about freedom and intention and all that God is doing. And there's a lot of don't be surprised what I'm saying to you that something unusual happens on retreat, because it should. Okay? So what we want to pray about and think about now is what Gerald May is called the consecration of hope. The consecration of hope. And he defines the word consecration as to be holy with. So to make the hope that we have, that we encounter love, that we live in love, as a holy hope, which means we don't just say, sometimes you hear people say, oh, I hope the weather will be fine tomorrow. Frankly, it doesn't really matter what you're hoping for, because the weather will be what it likes to be, and you have no say in the matter at all. But then, other things, you might be organising an event, and then you say, I hope the event will turn out well. Now, the question it begs, are you planning for this event? Are you doing the groundwork, or are you not? If you're not, how do you realistically hope that it's going to turn out fine? So in other words, sometimes we use the word hope to really mean that I'm not doing any strategy, I'm not doing any work, I just want it to turn out fine without me putting any effort. And if we think we're going to become holy and respond to God's grace and live in love at our deepest levels without working for it, we are fooling ourselves. So we want to look at some of those, the foolishness that we can all fall into from time to time, just so that we can catch ourselves out as it is happening. So, everyone see where we're going in the next session? Okay. Consecration, he says, means consciously participating in love, intentionally opening ourselves to accept the divinely given gift. He then suggests, well, I won't go through it because it takes too much time. He suggests doing a couple of exercises. One's about breathing, one is about walking, and the other one is about talking. And he says, just do a little exercise amongst yourself. And this is something you can practice later on. We won't do it now. But about breathing. And the fact is, we breathe in and out constantly, and we don't even think about it. We don't think about breathing. It's just one of those things that we do automatically, day and night. But the moment we start to think about our breathing, we often change our breathing. Bless you. We often change our breathing. It's something that, okay, I think I'm not breathing correctly. The air, I should be breathing in deeper lungs. Change my posture maybe so I can breathe better. Relax again. And he's saying, if my breathing is actually happening normally, because that's how I am, then do I really need to change it? And the answer is, no, I don't. But he says, so therefore, why do we actually change our breathing when we start to think about it? Because he's saying it goes so much at the heart of that impulse to control what we think about, what we are experiencing. The desire to control our lives is so profound. He says, try it also with the exercise of walking. We walk without thinking, correct? Anyone has to think about walking? No, I hope no. And but the moment, he says, we start to think about walking, it's like we are, we can walk a bit funny. Am I taking the right steps? My step might be a bit longer than I need to, or shorter. In other words, the moment we start to think about something, we think we've got to change it. And he gives a funny little anecdote about an ant watching a centipede. So the centipede, has 100 legs, and that's why it's called a centipede. And so the ant says to the centipede one day, how do you keep all those legs moving all at once? And the centipede stopped and started to think about it, and then never walked again. Because he couldn't do it, he had to think about it, and everything was just much too complicated. Of course, it's just a story, but what May is getting at is that when we start to question some of these profound habits in us, and actually try to make them conscious, because if we're trying to be conscious of our deepest desire, the deepest longing of our soul, which is always the longing for love, then all these other, we might as well start looking at some of these other unconscious things that we do, and just to see what our reaction is. He says when things start to be healthy, and we're actually being attuned properly, then our walking, our breathing, when we're thinking about them, won't change. And he gives an example about himself that, obviously he was a counselor, a lecturer, and so forth. And I could identify in this, but he says, with speaking, he said, I would speak and so forth, but then when I first started to think about myself speaking, I found myself stilted. I became kind of self-conscious about my speaking. And he said, it took me a while, before some years, if I remember correctly, that from thinking about the exercise to actually being able to do it consciously and being able to communicate that way. In other words, he developed the habit of speaking that was kind of speaking out of his head, not so much from his heart, emotionally at the same time. It's a very important exercise. So I'll leave you to do those exercises for yourself later on. And he also says, don't expect changes quickly. It will take a long time, maybe even years of constantly working at these things. But remember, the purpose is just to help us to get deeper. He says, so we need to grow into a self-awareness without becoming self-conscious. And that's essentially what these exercises are all about. To be aware of myself at a very deep level, but not becoming self-conscious. What's self-consciousness about? Self-consciousness refers to a certain embarrassment that we feel. We think that everybody is aware of what I'm thinking, that the whole world is watching me. The whole world isn't watching me. In being self-aware, it means I'm attuned to a whole lot of dimensions that are happening in my life. And as we become more open to the deeper reality, that this is exactly the experience of the saints. They, particularly the mystics who write about this, they're very self-aware, profoundly self-aware of who they are, what's happening at a particular moment, but they're not self-conscious because their awareness is profoundly immersed in God. He then goes on to say, well, he calls it the sacrament of the present moment. Sacrament, I know, has a very theological meaning attached to it, but sacrament is also a sign that does what it signifies. That's the sacramental theology side of things. But there's also another use of the word sacrament, just meaning a sign in general, but also he's using it in terms of a moment of grace. So as a moment of grace. He says, what good is it that I have solved the centipede's problem? Okay, so what's the purpose of trying to get deeper into these actions that we do unconsciously if they don't actually bring me into the presence of God? And he said, the great goodness of immediate awareness is that it forms the only foundation upon which true consecration can happen. To claim my desire for love most fully, I must feel that desire right here and now in the midst of my daily activities. Otherwise, what's going to happen? We'll have these nice ideas, deep insights even, and maybe a breakthrough during this time of retreat. But then we'll go back home, we'll start our normal activities, we'll get busy again, and then any ground that we make on this retreat, we will quickly lose. And it's not meant to be like that. It's actually, our annual retreat is meant to somehow let us dig the soil deep enough so that it does change our lives. Now, maybe not radically, because our lives can't change all that radically all the time, but it is meant to change our lives. So, we are meant to be attuned to this desire for love at any given moment, which doesn't mean, and I'll be the first one to put my hand up, I'm not aware of my desire for love at any given moment. I'm often aware that there's something deeper that is happening. I don't quite understand it at that moment, but I'm aware of that. Sometimes things are deeper still, but many other times I'm distracted. To say yes to love, I need to form my intention with authentic presence in this real moment. To consecrate my intention, so to make it holy, I must consciously be involved with God. Realize that God is involved with all of us, right here and right now. This can happen fully only with immediate, present-centered awareness. That's what he's calling the sacrament of the present moment. In a lot of the spiritual literature, this is simply called the practice of the presence of God. I hope we've all heard about that. The whole practice of the presence of God isn't just a mental exercise. It's meant to attune us basically to what May is saying. He's just using different language, but it's the same reality. By being aware that we're in the presence of God, that enables us then to sense his presence within our lives, and then to attune everything, all the motions and desires inside, to somehow redirect them to him. Whether we're experiencing holy thoughts or beautiful feelings and desires, or whether we want to kill one of our sisters, or whatever, not kill them, but anyway, we want to say something that's a bit harsh, or me want to kill one of my brothers. Because the reality is sometimes we do get upset with those that we live with, that we work with, and that we are supposed to love the most. Still other times, when I am terribly caught up in activity or strife, I feel distant from both God and my own desire. Then I can only recall my desire to desire. And because it is what is real at that moment, it is sufficient. Thus, consecration is possible whenever immediate awareness happens. The two become one. I remember when I was in my first year in the seminary, and I had never really heard about the practice of the presence of God. And one of the seminarians, who was in his later years at the time, came to my room, we're talking, and he said to me, you know what, I haven't prayed an aspiration in 40 minutes. And we would have spiritual conversations together. He was also quite a few years older than I was. And I thought, yeah, big deal, And it was just his way of telling me I should be living, and he should be living in the presence of God, and be aware of that presence. And that he hadn't thought about it for 40 minutes. I thought to myself, gee, that's pretty good, I don't always think of God all the time, but it was just a very gentle way to be mindful of the presence of God. And as we grow in holiness, one of the things that becomes more impacting on us, and it's mysterious how it happens, is we are mindful that we are in the presence of God, that we are deeply loved by him, that we are held in his arms. We don't necessarily feel his presence, but we're aware of it. There's a realization that happens. In 1667, he goes on to say, Brother Lawrence told his superior that we need only to know God intimately present in us, to address ourselves to God at every moment. The phrase, the sacrament of the present moment, comes from the translated writings of Jean-Pierre de Caussade, a French Jesuit priest of the early 18th century, emphatically describing his experience of faith. He said that everyone could be a saint by simple responsiveness to God's presence in each moment. There are no moments which are not filled with God's infinite holiness, so that there are none we should not honour. Beautiful. Continually renewed immediacy in the present wonderful moment, I can think of no better description. Just repeat the words to yourself. It is a homecoming. There is more to it than a state of mind or consciousness. Brother Lawrence sought the present moment in order to practice the presence of God. And that's the essence of what we should be doing. So we're bringing ourselves home. And the practice of the presence of God, the recollection. I remember reading several books about St. Pio of Pietrelcina. And while he would be meeting constantly people, he would have the practice of recollecting himself. And I don't know exactly what he did, but those who were with him knew that they knew that he was trying to really just be more attuned to the presence of God. A friend of mine who died, dear friend actually, who died about 20 years ago now, 21 years ago, sorry, he used to say to me that even in their high school, he went to a Catholic high school, and the Catholic high schools were still very Catholic at that time. He said, the practice of consecrating the hour. And I said, what was that, Peter? And he said, in the middle of the exam, whether it's, whatever the hour was, every hour, we would stop for a few seconds and just pause, think that we're in the presence of God, and make the hour holy. Now, it seems like a distraction in one sense, but they're just little practices, and probably not very practical for a high school anyway, but it was those practices of the spiritual life that were impacting on the culture of a school, and to remind all the students that whatever you're doing, whether it's an exam, your homework, you play football, and I'm not sure if they stopped the game, by the way, when they were playing football. Okay, everybody, you're in the middle of a try, stop and make holy sanctify the moment. But it was just one of those, to show the desire of wanting to be in the presence of God. Sometimes taken a bit too far, perhaps, but there's certainly practically and privately people can do that. So, prayerful presence and powerful presence. For over a decade, this is May, I have collected observations of the physical effects of contemplative practices. Let me describe just 3. First, people who practice this kind of discipline over periods of years report an expansion of perception. Our perception deepens. And it makes sense, it should deepen. If we're trying to live as contemplatives, the encounter with the mystery, who God is, has to open us up. Our senses become more attuned. No longer are they simply aware of this or that, but instead they experience a more panoramic, all-inclusive awareness. It is like what athletes and artists sometimes describe at moments of peak performance. A football player said, "When I see the ball coming toward me, everything opens up. I am aware not just of the ball, but of everything, the other people on the field, the feel of the wind, the sound of the crowd. I can even sense the beating of my heart and the shape of the clouds in the sky." Wow, it's a real moment. Apparently St. John of the Cross, he used to love going outside at night and he would just be there in the silence and taking it all in. The crackle of the leaves, birds perhaps moving sometimes, something rustling through the woods, that sense, that openness. Because God will speak to us, yes, through our minds, but he does speak through the senses. Not that we're starting to hear things, but that's how the information and knowledge comes to our soul. And being fully alive isn't in some theoretical sense, that Jesus says, I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. It's partly also just being fully alive in our senses. So it's something very important. Number 2, the second effect of this contemplation. So a heightened, expansive perception. 2, most of us would be troubled by so much information hitting us all at once. But a second effect of contemplative practice is a natural, flowing responsiveness that deals with the situation of the moment spontaneously and incisively. So we're aware of a situation that requires quick, urgent action, and somehow we are better equipped to attend to it. We're able to, it might be an accident site, it might be some situation out of the ordinary, and we feel ourselves, we're in that situation, and we just take control, and we do it. This is something else that he says is one of the effects of contemplation. Great. Welcome here.
Can I sort to drop?
No, that's fine. It's good.
Just
Do you want to rest? That's okay?
yeah, that's
Great,
okay.
perfect. So, a third effect of contemplative practice is self-knowledge. Immediate present awareness means noticing not only what is around oneself, but what is within as well. It may not be a pleasant process because it involves facing painful and uncomplimentary aspects of oneself. Very important insight. But over time, one gains a much more realistic appraisal of one's strengths and weaknesses. Psychoanalysts would say there is less repression. More of what has been unconscious has become conscious. When I was in my early 30s, there was a friend of mine, a priest friend of mine, and he was in his, I'd say, mid-40s at the time. And I said to him, what tips can you give me to help me through my 30s, to grow as a man, as a human being, as a priest? And he said to me, gee, I don't know, I did most of my 30s, and he was telling me about his own life. But then he came with a little insight, and I've never forgotten it, and it's true. He says, as I get older, I find myself becoming more and more aware of the consequences of my actions and the decisions I make. I thought, wow. And at that time, I was 31, and I had a certain amount of awareness, but I realized 21 years later now, or 20 years later, now you know how old I am, that I thought, he's right. He's absolutely right. I still make decisions. I make the difficult decisions because I have to. I prefer I don't. I weigh things up a lot, but I am much more aware. So things that I would have said without thinking so much 20 years ago, because I thought they were right, now I'll still say them, but I just think about what they're going to achieve, the good they're going to do, but also the potential harm they're going to do. So it's something there, and I think as he was telling me, it's really the fruit and the practice of his own prayer that was going on at the time, and it wasn't just simply getting older. So of course, then May says, as we grow in these capacities in practicing the spiritual life, he says these capacities can be used for good or for ill. Right? So just like every good thing can be used, new technology, phones, drones can be used for amazing things, lifting medicines up to remote parts in the jungle or wherever. They can also be used to drop bombs on people, So he says, so too with the spiritual gains that we make here, they can be abused. These heightened perceptions, this awareness of our own self-knowledge, we can use it also to hurt somebody, which is malicious, but as we grow in inner freedom, the capacity for good or evil also increases. So by that same capacity there, Our Lady was sinless. But that doesn't mean she doesn't know how to do evil if she wanted to. It meant she chose not to. But her capacity would have been very, very great. Because her inner freedom is so great. So therefore, the malice can be also more intense. Whereas if somebody is imprisoned, and therefore a consequent lack of freedom inside because of something in their childhood, a disease or mental illness or whatever, there's a restriction about the degree of malice that they can actually bring about. So it just calls it out to be mindful of that. And therefore, which brings us to the next part in this consecration of hope, to make holy this desire to encounter the hope of living in love. He says to be mindful of our mixed motives. Very rarely are our motives completely pure. At least I'll put my hand up for being guilty there. And we'll say we want to do things to help somebody, but there can often be some personal interest for why we are doing something, and we may only recognize it later on in that. So there is certainly, we might say we love God very much, we want to be very religious. Okay, why? Why do we want to be religious? Well, because I want to be holy, I want to get to heaven. Someone recently said to me that they were complaining about something, and they said, I believe in hell. And I thought, yeah, so do I, but it's as if, and I realized what he was saying, that deep down, he's saying, so I don't want to get to hell, he says to me. That's essentially what he was saying. He didn't say that. He said, I believe in hell, and therefore I don't want to kind of get there. And I thought, yes, I believe in hell too, but I don't live because of my fear of hell. I try to live because I love heaven. And I know that the one who does what is right and good because they fear hell is also doing the same thing because they want to get to heaven. But the motive is very different. And ultimately, desiring to live a good life because you want to get to heaven makes for a happier Catholic or Christian or whatever the faith happens to be than, I want to do good because I don't want to end up in hell. Because one is obviously very disturbing and usually takes joy from a person's life. So we must be aware of our mixed motives. And the only cure against mixed motives is to be ruthlessly honest with ourselves. So as we're praying, as we're trying to live as authentically as we can, to live and seeking the desire to love at each moment, to also, at least if we don't recognize it at that moment, to recognize it later when we are having ourselves on. Some people who are more gifted, who are very, politicians or leaders, church leaders, and sometimes because they've got so many people saying, that's very good, you are so good at what you do, that's wonderful, they start to believe their own rubbish, their own rhetoric. And believe me, this is true. And I remember having this insight when I was working in the United States, and I thought, wow, the more gifts that somebody has, and remember this please, the more gifts someone has, the more mechanisms they have to deceive themselves. The more gifts that a person has, the more mechanisms they have to deceive themselves. Because in their gifts, they hide behind their gifts. And they think that their gifts is what makes them so rich. And their gifts, they forget, are gifts. Which means they didn't wish them. They were given to them, full stop. And so they exercise their gifts. And some people have pretty amazing gifts. And they wow people by these gifts, but they forget that inside they're actually very naked. So just keep that in mind, and the honesty, therefore, we must be so honest to not have ourselves on, and when we catch ourselves out later on, particularly when we make the examination of conscience at night, to admit as much as we can, as truthfully as we can, in the presence of God, sorry Lord, I did this, my motive wasn't upright, I did the right thing, you know my heart, but I let you down in some way. And our Lord understands that, right? He doesn't condemn us, He doesn't, chastise us or frown at us. Maybe sometimes we certainly make Him sad, but I think we make Him pleased when we show Him our honesty. And it's His Holy Spirit who reveals that to us. Now, another distinction He makes, and we're coming to the end of our time, is the difference between expectation and hope. And I started to touch on this earlier. Hopes can be realistic, or hopes can be unrealistic, in which case He calls them an expectation. An expectation is not a hope. I expect that I will get another meal sometime soon, because that's the practice that I've been going on. And I can also say, I hope that I will get another meal soon. But there are certain things of life that are different from hope, but we use the word hope mistakenly. And sometimes confusing expectations as hopes. He gives a couple of examples. I'll just read one. This is about the wife of an abusive alcoholic, kept hoping, in inverted commas, her husband would stop drinking and beating her. But she took no action against him because what she called hope was really an expectation that he would change. She kept convincing herself against all evidence that it just would not happen again. But of course, it did repeatedly. Remember I said a moment ago that I hope the event turns out really well that I'm planning for next month. But am I putting the planning in there, the strategy? Am I getting heads together to make sure that there's enough money being spent on this, that there's enough preparation? If I'm not, then my hope is not really a hope. It's wishful thinking. And by recognizing the expectations and the realistic hopes is what May is saying, you know what, if you really want to live in love constantly, then don't expect that anything's going to happen unless you are ruthlessly honest with yourself. It really goes back to the honesty question here. Otherwise, our hopes will not be genuine hope. On the other hand, if I am doing all my work properly, I'm planning, I'm doing things in detail, and then I've done all that I could possibly do, and I'm praying at the same time, and I say, God, I am now entrusting it to you. I hope that you bless this and that you make it bear fruit. That is real hope. Real hope. Because I've done my part, but also I am entrusting to Him, because I know that my work alone without God's grace is not going to result in anything. Saint, what's his name? Founder of the Jesuits. Ignatius Loyola. Saint Ignatius Loyola. And what's his feast day? 31st, I think, of July. Saint Ignatius says, pray as if everything depends on you. Work as if everything depends on God. Pray as if everything depends on you. Work as if everything depends on God. Sometimes you may have heard it said in the other way. Pray as if everything depends on God. Work as if everything depends on you. Saint Ignatius was much more subtle than that. Pray as if everything depended on you. So you're asking God to do the work here. But pray as if everything depended on you. In other words, put your heart into it. Be demanding on yourself in your prayer. Apply your energies as much as you can, right? Sometimes we're tired, sometimes we're sick, whatever. But put your whole heart into it. Work, this is the all part now, as if everything depends on God. In other words, with calm, with serenity, not fretting, not rushing, not pushing yourself and then making a mistake because you're rushing too much, you're not thinking clearly about things. So work as if everything depends on God. Pray as if everything depends on you. Brilliant line. Then a quick word on fantasy. Fantasy is often something that we think is useless, when we're escaping from our lives. But May is saying that if we want to develop also our life of hope and trusting in God, our fantasy actually plays a role. You see, if I want to know, and one of the other chapters we talked about where your treasure is. If I want to know something about where your heart is, where your treasure is, I'll ask you about what you fantasize. Where do your fantasies go? Because that's where, you see, and hope and fantasy are actually quite closely connected together. The medievalists, the scholastics, would say that hope is based in the memory, is founded in the memory. And because hope is the virtue that connects us with the future, makes us look forward to the future with confidence, but our memories of the past and God's intervention in our past makes us then confident that He will also intervene in the future to guide the events of our lives in such a way so that everything will turn out just fine. Now, that's my memory is going to be drawn to where my hopes are, to where my longing is, whether I realize it or not. And fantasy is often connected with that. So if I find myself fantasizing about things that are very different from what is occupying my life, there's a chance, not a chance, there's a very good reason there to start looking deeper. I'm either unhappy about my work or my life. I'm dissatisfied about something that's going on there because that's where my mind is going. My longing is going to the fantasy. And by actually taking my fantasies to prayer, it can help me to be ruthlessly honest with myself where I am at that moment and to talk to the Lord about it. And that will help me to pay attention to what is or isn't happening in my life and in my work that may actually need some genuine attention. So fantasies can actually be quite revealing to us about what we are and what's happening in our lives. And lastly, or second last, a brief note on discretion. He says, this living, constantly seeking the place of love, is wonderful for us, and it should be something that we could share, but we can't share it with everybody, right? We can't share it with everybody. We will only share it with those who can appreciate it, and we shouldn't share it with those who cannot. What does our Lord say to us in the Gospels? Do not throw pearls before swine. Not that we're calling anybody a swine or a pig, right? But we're saying, don't give to somebody something precious that they cannot appreciate. Don't share your heart with someone who cannot appreciate what's in your heart, because they'll mock it or they'll make light of it. Something sacred, they're not worthy of it. They don't deserve it. So keep it to yourself. But that doesn't mean you act insincerely with them. No, you act from the place of genuineness. But you also have to pause and realize who it is that you're talking with. If it's somebody who has the capacity to receive something of your treasure, by all means, share it with discretion. If it's someone who hasn't got that capacity, it's like trying to explain things to little children. They ask you a question that's very profound, but you know they don't have the maturity of judgment and the understanding to understand it fully. So what do you say to them? Oh, no, don't worry, you're too young for that. You can't understand anything. You insult the children by saying that. But a good teacher would say to them, you know what? This is a very big question, it's deep, and when you get older, 10 years from now, ask someone else that question. and you'll be able to understand it even more. But now I'll tell you this much, but there's a lot more to be said. What you've done to the child is you've told them what enough to answer their question for the time being, but also you've opened their expectations and hopefully their hope and their curiosity to what else lies there. And they know that in the future they're going to have to ask that question again, and then they can also share it. On a practical, and appreciate it then, on a practical level, I remember a woman friend of mine in America, and I was, how old? I think I must have been in my early 40s, and she was in her mid 40s. She said to me, Father, in the last few years, I've realized who my true friends are. And she said, and I tell you what, I haven't had any trouble cutting some of those friendships. Because as she realized that some of her supposed friends were not real friends, that she could no longer live in a relationship of some kind of intimacy where she was sharing her true self, whereas they were holding back and weren't being so loyal towards her. And I thought, you know what? That is true. That's why very often the number of genuine, deep friends that we have, you count on one hand. And here I'm not talking your family. Your family love you and care about you, but that doesn't mean that they are necessarily your friends. Your family will tell you lots of things that they think are for your benefit, but they're telling you from their point of view, not necessarily from your benefit, right? So should we live and listen to everything our family tells us? Absolutely not. That's not out of disrespect for the family. That's simply out of a recognition of the relationships. Yep, they might want to help. Wonderful. Your true friends will listen to you and know. And remember those two freedom questions that we were asking yesterday? How costly would it to give up this friend or this relationship, this love? And secondly, how free do I feel within that relationship? In a true friendship, you feel free, or as free as you possibly can be. So we need discretion in sharing those deep things about us, particularly this consecration of hope that May is talking about here. And then the fullness of this consecration means that, excuse me, if you have a community of understanding people, it's really the continuation of with whom can we share these things. And it's got to be with the right people. If we're blessed to be in a community of understanding people with whom you can share some of your experiences, then all the much better. But the fact is, you may only be able to share some of these things with one person. And the good news is, you only need one other person to share them with. You don't need 3 or 4, because they can't all appreciate it. But if you can find one person and share your heart with them, or some of these things, you don't have to share everything, they will listen to you, they don't judge you, they see the treasure for what it is, and they love you in that. And it's a beautiful sharing that goes on, and that will be indeed a blessing from on high. So, as we carry on this journey into the heart, and we explore this question of hope and consecrating ourselves, living in that presence of God and being deeply attuned, we realize that as we discover the treasure within, that is not something that we can just share with everybody, but only with those who are truly capable of receiving what we have to give.